Hello and welcome to another episode of A Fresh Perspective with Jeff Charles, with your host, your boy, your favorite conservatarian contrarian, Jeff Charles, where we prefer truth over narrative and principles over personalities. And I'm coming back at you with another fire conversation, another great interview, and you might notice something a little bit different about my background. It's not the same one that you're used to. So for those of you who don't know, I'm no longer in Austin, Texas. I have moved to Jacksonville, Florida. And most of you already know why, but I don't want to distract from what we're talking about here, so we can discuss that later. But again, I have another fire guest for you today, another conversation, another fresh perspective. But before we get into all of that, just want to remind you to please like this video, share this video. And if you haven't already subscribed to my YouTube channel, you need to get that done right now. Just click that notification bell. That way you'll be notified whenever I upload a new interview. And also sharing it also helps me a lot. Liking it helps me a lot. Also, if you want to support my work, I've got the links in the show notes there. I've got the CashApp, the Venmo app, and all the other apps. Every little bit helps. And remember that LibertyNation.com is a proud sponsor of A Fresh Perspective. Check out LibertyNation.com for all of your conservatarian news, original articles, and analysis, videos, podcasts, Liberty Nation Radio, and their signature TV program, The Conservative 5, all on LibertyNation.com. Conservative news where truth matters. Now then, to get on to the reason that you guys are here. Now, we've all been hearing about the economy and the inflation, and we're all dealing with the gas prices at the pump, and we're all tired of it, at least most of us. So here to talk about it, I have recovering investment banker and author of The War on Small Business, Miss Carol Roth. How are you doing, Mrs. Roth?
Jeff, it's great to be with you, and I am doing fantastic. All of those things like, X dollar gas and so on considered.
Yeah, I mean, I had steak last night. I had to like sell my car to get steak last night because I love steak. But I was willing to do it. But I mean, I don't know how much longer we're gonna have to do this. But before we get into all of that, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Oh, goodness. Well, as you mentioned, I've had a long and storied history doing lots of things, many of them revolving around the financial services industry and some of them not. As you noted, I had a career on Wall Street. I've raised billions of dollars in capital for businesses and done all different kinds of things, mergers and LBOs, IPOs, capital raising, and the like. I play myself on TV. Many of you have seen me in all different kinds of arenas. You may not have seen me as a judge on Mark Burnett's TV show, America's Greatest Makers, which was a tech competition show on TBS, but I did that as well. I have my own action figure, which is really cool, and I'm an outsourced chief customer officer for a toy/collectibles company. I sit on boards of directors. I make investments. I am just the modern day Ben Franklin, basically.
Now, why did you leave Wall Street? Why did you stop being an investment banker?
So I only went into investment banking, and I was the first person in my family to go to college and graduate. My dad was an electrician. My mom didn't go to college. It didn't really know. I didn't know what an investment banker even was until I went there. I went to Wharton undergrad, and everyone was like, "Oh, well, if you really like to deep dive into something, you become a management consultant. If you have ADD, you become an investment banker because you can work on all these deals." And I'm like, "Oh, that is me." So really, I financed most of my education myself back in the mid-90s. I had $40,000 in college debt, which is probably around the average today. But I had it all the way back then. And so I wanted something where I could pay down my debt really quickly, as well as gain just a ton of experience. And I did really well there. I was a VP and an officer of the firm by the time I was 25 years old. So I really killed it, but I never really wanted to be the world's best investment banker. And once I had the financial flexibility, decided to figure out what I wanted to do. Funny enough, one of the first businesses I started was my own investment bank / broker dealer with my husband, who was in that career for some period of time as well. But ultimately, have been trying to figure out what it is that I want to do when I grow up, and collected a ton of really cool experiences along the way. And hopefully one day soon will become a game show host.
Nice. So there's really nothing that you don't plan on doing at some point or another, right?
I mean, just my philosophy in life is if I want to do something, then I just find a way to do it eventually. Like, I'm not the kind of person who has a bucket list. Like, if there's a thing I'd like to do, I just try and do it. So, and that's actually how I got to television. And funny enough, to political commentary, because I really just wanted to be on TV and wanted to be a game show host, and you kind of figured out my way onto TV. And then back in 2012, when Mitt Romney ended up as the GOP candidate to go up against Obama, they were like, oh, I guess we need someone who knows what private equity means and like who can explain like what this guy did for a living, and things like the auto bailouts and all these things that were coming up. And at that time I was like, hey, I want to talk about things. So, that just happened. I knew nothing about politics. And you kind of got dragged into this insane world over the last decade or so.
Gotcha. So I wasn't going to ask this, but I kind of have to now because my curiosity is getting the better of me. How does one go about getting an action figure made out of them?
Okay, do you want to see it?
Yes.
Okay,
yeah.
Hold on. This is real time stuff. Okay, so this is the Carol Roth action figure. As you can see, looks just like me.
Yes.
And as I mentioned, one of my clients is a toy company. They work in the collectible doll and fashion figure space. You can see some of them behind me as well. And when I wrote my very first book called The Entrepreneur Equation back, a dozen or so years ago, I wanted to do something that was, kind of a cool premium. So I asked them if they could do an action figure / doll that I could offer. If you bought so many books, you would get one. And it depended how well, like if you knew me, like if you were one of our doll collectors, it was maybe like 6 books. And if it was my dad, it was like 20 books, you know what I mean? So I kept changing it around depending on who you were. And so that's what they did. And, so that was part of it. And the other part of it was the way that idea kind of came to be is that I am on the cover of that book, something that was sort of conceived by my publisher. And at that time, the big bookstores were really important buyers. It was kind of pre-Amazon, like dominating everything. And they told my publisher that I was too attractive to be taken seriously as a business author. So they should either ugly me up or pull me off the cover.
Wait, that sounds sexist as hell.
I mean, it was like so dumb. So I like thought about it for 5 seconds. I'm like, nope. And not only are we going to do that, we're going to do a fashion doll / action figure. So
yeah. Well, a lot of people say the same thing about me. I mean, they don't take me seriously because I'm so beautiful. So I understand your struggle.
It's sort of distracting. It's hard to have the conversation, but I am a professional and I am going to pull my way through on this. So we'll try and make it. I might need a break, like just a
of course
cool down and stuff about halfway through. I'll let you know. But anyway, so that's how. But the question of how do you get your own like that is that you don't, which is what makes it so cool, right? Because if everyone could get one, then it wouldn't be interesting. So you have to stick with your little bobblehead BS kind of stuff. All you people trying to do it, it's not like this. It's not like a real thing.
I think I would prefer a bobblehead of me though than an action figure. I don't know. That might fit my personality.
Yeah, way to set your bar low. That's great. Good job.
For me, it's high though. And then again, if AOC can get her own action figure, maybe I should set my sights.
Lord.
So before we drill down into all the stuff that's going on right now, why don't you kind of give us your assessment of of America's overall economic situation, especially over the past year since the Democrats have been in power?
The State of the Union
is
a hot mess. And don't let anybody tell you otherwise. I mean, economically, we have been through a historic period, one that we have never seen, where you had the government make these insane set of decisions that decided who was going to thrive and who was going to fight to survive. They enabled a historic transfer of wealth from savers and retirees and in Main Street to Wall Street and the already wealthy and well-connected. So it's just a crazy period. And what was done printing trillions of dollars. And when I say printing, I mean this figuratively. Like the Federal Reserve doesn't
Right.
actually control the printing. That's a function of the Treasury, but they have the ability to go in and go, we have money and we're going to go out and buy securities in the market. Now, if I went into my bank account or you went into your bank account and we said, I have money, I put a couple $1 trillion and went out and bought things, it would be called fraud, boys and girls. But when the Federal Reserve does it, it's called monetary policy. And so they went out with money that didn't exist, trillions of dollars, and poured that in, which drove down interest rates and increased the value of assets, again, artificially, just by their design. On top of that, the government spent trillions of dollars in stimulus, as we know, part of that, which again was monetized by the Fed. And you had a government who decided, like, hey, let's like turn off a third of our economy for a while. We could just like turn it back on later, like it's a modem that we're power cycling. No, you
it'll pick up
can't.
right where we left off.
No, you can't. And so that and some of the other structural, fiscal, and other policy decisions disrupted the labor market. It disrupted the supply chain, and it's created this crazy situation that we're in where we have inflation that's at the highest level that it's been in 40 years. And again, this is before the Russia-Ukraine stuff even happened.
Right.
This is
Right.
all just coming out of COVID. We have a scenario where we have 1.8 jobs available for every job seeker out there. At the same time, because of what happened during the last Great Recession financial crisis, we're severely underbuilt in terms of homes on a scale of like 4 to 5+ million homes. And yeah, we've got an administration who doesn't want us to have energy independence, creating economic and national security issues. So it's like a really, from an intellectual standpoint, as like somebody who's kind of nerdy, it's like, wow, like this is like historic and interesting, and glad I can document it. Like as somebody who's just an empathetic human being, like I can't believe that these blah 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 stars and exclamation points people have done this, and the damage that they have caused to the average American and the dent that they have created in terms of economic freedom and wealth creation opportunities for everyone. It is infuriating. So that's kind of my macro state of the union.
Okay, that makes sense. Well, I think one of the reasons why the government, whether it's Democrat or Republican, I think one of the reasons why they get away with messing up the economy is because most people don't really understand how that works, how government policy can influence the economy. Now, I know that the president doesn't have full control over how the economy goes, but when it comes to inflation specifically, because that's what everybody's dealing with right now. I mean, I went to the grocery store yesterday and I about had a heart attack. And what specific policies has this administration implemented that has contributed to the inflation? I know you mentioned the Federal Reserve, printing money, but what other things has this administration done to contribute to that problem? Like, why are we seeing this today?
Yeah. So again, this is something that, and I'm a straight shooter. Some of you aren't going to want to hear this, but I don't care because I'm just telling you like it is. So some of this some of this was inherited, right? Some of this happened under the Trump administration, with the Congress that he had, but he had the power. He could have vetoed this stuff, and he liked the idea of throwing Donnie dollars out there and saying, "I'm giving you relief money," and he was very much somebody pushing the Federal Reserve to keep interest rate low. So he did not help this cause. So we inherited part of the money printing. We inherited a lot of trillions of dollars of spending. When the Biden administration came in, they could have righted the ship. Instead, let's just kind of go through month by month. The very first thing that they did was decide that they were going to be energy unfriendly, and so they canceled oil and gas leases. They canceled the Keystone Pipeline, and importantly, they also kowtowed to the people who are pushing this concept of ESG, which you may have heard of. It's called environmental, social, and governance. That's what ESG stands for. And it's basically these kind of woo-woo principles, very important, good steward of capital, good, participant in the community and social corporate whatever blah blah blah, and they've been pushing that, so they've been putting pressure on the investors and the lenders not to invest in things that the rest of us would like for them to invest in, things like natural gas and oil and traditional energy sources. So the combination of those two has put us in this vulnerable position in terms of not having enough, oil and gas to be able to keep the prices down, not just here in this country, but obviously to help our allies around the world, which again, in part could have been avoided. And frankly, he could stop this any day now. He could turn this around, but he won't. So, that's kind of the first piece. And oh, by the way, releasing 1 million barrels a day from a strategic reserve is insanity. Strategic reserves are not for bad policy decisions, and we consume 20 million barrels a day worldwide, 100 million barrels. So that does nothing. Okay, so that's one thing.
Wow.
The second thing that happened is around this idea of the American Rescue Plan that happened back in March of 2021.
Okay.
And there's been so much spending, it's hard to keep track of it all, right?
It is.
But the American Rescue Plan, if I recall correctly, was something like another $1.9 trillion. Yeah. And again, you have to say, like, as bad as it was in 2020, in 2021, we were in a very different place. We had vaccines that were being rolled out widely. We had had a year of experience of knowing how the virus impacted things. You had a lot of jurisdictions starting to open things up. You had some jurisdictions that have been open up for a year that we had data on. The idea that at that point, that with this potential inflation that was already, by the way, starting to percolate, that you'd throw another $2 trillion on that fire was insanity. And it also did these kind of long tail things like keep people out of the workforce longer, continue to, and once you keep them out of the workforce, people don't have, or the businesses don't have enough personnel, so it impacts the supply chain. So all of these things that we were kind of contending with, that he had the opportunity to go, you know what, we're going to get back to normal. And he could have been the president that had this super fast recovery, like enough's enough, we're going to change the trajectory. But that's not what the Democrats, and particularly the progressive Democrats, and whoever the heck else is, kind of feeding in, on a corporate or globalist basis. That's not what they want. So they just added more fuel to this fire, and what was going to be bad was just made, even worse. And then, as we know, once that snowball starts to pick up steam, it's really hard to stop it. So those were the kinds of things that he did. And then he certainly didn't do anything to like counteract that, like continue to add additional spending bills. The infrastructure bill was passed, big budgets and whatnot. There was no like, oh, let's make it easier for small businesses to hire. I mean, there was no actual action that I could look to and go, oh, well, this was, something that was actually really good for the economy. Anything that has happened has just sort of happened because of, everything else that's been set up. He's either been a detriment or neutral, but there's not a single policy that I can point to where I'm like, oh yeah, that really kind of helped. could have been worse, or that put us on the right track. So he didn't do that. And then, he's out there telling you about the Biden boom and how great your economy is, folks. Aren't you enjoying your great economy with the adults back in charge?
The Biden boom and the Putin price hike. Right.
Yeah. I mean, and that's, part of the frustration, because I've been following this so closely, and I've been warning about this for 2 years on all, and I have documentation on lots of TV programs and things. So I'm not just saying this, you can go back and look at it. But it was like, there's going to be no inflation. Oh, it's going to be a little hot. Oh, it's going to be transitory. Well, it may be a little bit, but, it's only really going to impact the rich. It's, Putin. It's the greedy business's fault. Oh, it's Putin's fault. Oh, bread lines are a great way to meet your neighbor. You know what I mean? It's just like, it just devolved like every single couple of months that the narrative has changed, and it's just so dishonest. I would have so much more respect to just go, this is challenging. These are the reasons why this was caused. These are the things that we're going to do or not do, in response. But like the idea that you're trying to spin and sell this as like some kind of a benefit is it's just icky and it's evil.
It is. It's also really stupid because I don't think that people are actually convinced by this, but I know they have to try whatever they can. But here's what here's my question. I want to talk about energy again for a second, because when I'm looking at the situation, especially when, Ukraine and Russia jumped off, the response from Democrats was, okay, if we don't want to be relying on other countries for energy, then we got to push for green energy. We got to have all of our cars be green and whatever. And I'm thinking, it's going to take us decades to get to that point. Now, here's my thing, because there's so much against us drilling for our own oil and fracking and all that good stuff. Even from before this, you just mentioned what Biden did when he first took office. So it's obvious that they don't want us to drill. Here's my thing. If they really want to move towards green energy, but also make us energy independent, and I'm sorry, like a 10-year-old can figure this out. Okay, let's move towards that green energy. Let's do that. But in the meantime, why don't we drill for our own oil and figure it out that way? That way, Americans aren't hurting. And yes, we can. I think even conservatives would be okay with moving more towards green energy. But why? But here's my thing. That's a common sense solution. So, in your opinion, I know you can't read minds, but you look at these things. Why aren't they doing it that way? Why are they so against us drilling for our own oil when we can just do it temporarily until we get to that green energy point?
Yeah, it's so disingenuous, just to give you a different way to look at it. Like, first of all, the demand isn't stopping today. So all it has done, if you actually cared about the planet, you'd want us to be in control as much of it as possible in the interim, because we have the most incentives and the most technology to be able to do it more cleanly. You wouldn't want it to go to all of the shady and bad actors around the world who don't really care, which is
right.
What we have seen happen. So, that in and of itself is so disingenuous, and everybody should call it out. And as you said, too, like if I was on a medicine for some, horrible disease, God forbid, and someone said, well, there's this new drug that we know is going to do it cheaper, and it's going to have fewer side effects, and it's going to be better for you, and it's going to be better for everybody. You don't pull me off the first medicine until the second medicine exists. It doesn't exist. And by the way, we are so underinvested in commodities, things like copper, the biggest commodity inputs to running our electrical grid is copper. Like, nobody's been investing in copper mining for like the last multiple decades. So like, even if they wanted to do this over the next 10 or 20 years, there's no way they're going to be able, because we just don't have the raw materials to do this. So there's just a fundamental insanity disconnect. Now, why is it that we're listening to, goofy teenagers from other countries and goofy people who are actresses that put into Congress who know nothing about our policy? And there's a whole slew of various conspiratorial ideas, but I think as a student of human nature, I think it just comes down to the dynamic of power and control. There could be an aspect of the fact that if you think about the wealth and how it is divided up in our nation, the red side of the equation is very heavily wealthy, not from technology or financial services, but from energy. So if you want that portion to not have as much power, cutting off the thing that makes them wealthy seems like something that potentially could be a motivating factor. It could be that the greedy people who want to make more money just aren't part of that inner circle, but they have a jump on being able to be part of this new set of financial opportunities. So they're pushing the ones that give them the most incentive. And I've got to imagine, just on a global basis, there's a group of people who just don't want America to be successful. I mean, we've heard stories, and again, I have no way to verify if they're true, but it makes sense, that Russian propaganda is behind a bunch of these green pushes that got their biggest customers, like in Germany and the EU, to come off because they know they're supplying it. So
yeah, it's not hard to imagine.
It's most of the time in life, and I come at this again as somebody who's experienced in both human nature and financial elements, like you can just follow the money, and there's usually a money and power reason behind everything. And so of those three things that I've laid out as possibilities, I think that any one or some piece of all of them are very plausible and very likely to be a component of why there is this push.
Gotcha. That's kind of what I thought too. I mean, there's usually, greed, who, it's like that saying, key bono, who benefits. And so certain people are benefiting from us not being energy independent. When it comes to inflation, whether it's gas prices or even the grocery store and things like that, I mean, do you see any light at the end of the tunnel for this, or are we going to be in this for the long haul? I'm almost afraid to ask that question, but I have to.
So, I see trends more than I see like exact percentages. Like anyone who can tell you, oh, a specificity, this is going to be how much it is just, making things up. Right. And the reality is some of this is going to depend on decisions that are made. It's going to depend on the Federal Reserve rate hikes. It's going to depend on if Congress passes, more insane spending. There are a lot of things that can change the trajectory from here and exacerbate it or, contain it a little bit. I think the reality of the situation is that there's enough kind of structural issues that is going to keep inflation on the higher side for some time. As I mentioned, you have 1.8 jobs available for every job seeker out there. So even if you get some more people going out and looking for jobs, or even if you get a recession and some of the companies can't hire, you're not going to have these mass layoffs like you would in a traditional recession. And then you're going to have people who want to come into the workforce who say, well, everything's more expensive, so I need higher wages. So it's not like the wages are going to recede. Right. And when they need higher wages, then the company's cost structure goes up. They pass that along to the consumer. The job seekers go, oh, well, it's even more expensive now. I need even more of a wage. And you end up with something called a wage price spiral. So I think that's, a structural issue. As I mentioned, the housing market, because we are underbuilt by 4 to 5 million units, even if you get some cooling off because you've got, higher mortgage rates, you still have a lot of people who need housing. And you have a lot of corporate buyers right now who are flush with cash that are competing with the average American, unfortunately, to buy houses and then, create rental properties. So I don't see that massively cooling or deflating anytime soon. You've got the commodity issues. We're trying to ramp back up from the COVID situation. We haven't even gotten to a consumption level worldwide on an energy basis that's anywhere near normalized. So again, ex-Russia and the Ukraine, we're underproducing, and it's going to be, depending on how long that goes on, a continued issue. And then this push for decarbonization is going to impact all different kinds of commodities on an ongoing basis as well. Plus, now you've got the Russia and Ukraine piece. So you've got things, like food potential shortage of fertilizer going into planting season that creates a long tail for food shortages. Things like propane shortages that impact the drying of grains and wheats that can lead into that. So that has the potential of creating, instability and social unrest, worldwide, which then has all kinds of implications. So the reality is we're going up against tougher comp numbers. When I call comparables, when you have a higher inflation number that you are benchmarking against in terms of growth, that you need even more growth for it to look like 10% or 7%. So even if it comes down to 6% growth, what you have to understand is that's cumulative. It's on top of all of the inflation that we've already seen. So it's not like it's going to all of a sudden go away. All of those price hikes that you've seen become permanent until the point of time that we have deflation for whatever reason, productivity or otherwise. So I think we're going to be in a period where we're going to have slower growth. We may not have a recession. We may, maybe 2023, but at a minimum, some stagnation there. And then you have elevated inflation. Again, it may not go 20 to 50, percent, God forbid. It may not be 10, it may not even be 7, but if it's 5 or 6 for a long period of time, that's going to be really bad for everybody. So that's kind of where I stand today, and we'll keep monitoring and see kind of what direction. I mean, there is a scenario where everything just, completely breaks loose, and then things get really bad. We've got the dollar being threatened as reserve currency. I mean, there are some things out there that are just like a little too teetering on the edge for my liking that could just send us in a really bad scenario. But I do think that's, at this juncture, probably the outside scenario. I think the realistic scenario is that we have just a lot of pain for several years.
So it's going to hurt, but it's not quite time to move to the bunker yet, right? That's kind of what I'm hearing?
I mean, listen, I'm a preparation gal, so like you might want to get the bunker ready, but you don't have to move it.
Okay. All right. And on that note,
and that sunshine and rainbows, sparkly, fantastic thing.
Well, hopefully, I mean, if it does last for a few years, hopefully it does go back to normal and we don't have more to worry about. But you mentioned something interesting. Like you said, I think there was like 1.8 million jobs for every one person seeking a job.
1.8 jobs would be yes. So like almost 2 times the number of job seekers. If we had 1.8 million jobs, we would be screwed.
I was like, okay, I heard you wrong. But why is that happening? Because I know in September, like we got rid of the federal enhanced unemployment benefits and stuff like that. And I know that there are a lot of small businesses, which we'll be talking about in a second, that are still understaffed. What's going on here? Well, why aren't people getting back to work?
So we had a few things that happened. And again, this is the outgrowth of really stupid policy. So you had a number of retirees, and that number is around 3 million. So around 3 million retirees prematurely came out of the workforce. During COVID, they're obviously the most vulnerable. They got some extra money. Their portfolios were probably doing pretty well from all the asset bubbles. They had some extra equity in their house. So they're like, I'm just not going to chance it. And that's a lot of retirees that came out of the workforce. The second piece of that is that we had legal, not illegal, but legal immigration that fell off a cliff. So we have fewer legal immigrants who are in the workforce than before February of 2020. And based on the trajectory of where the economy would have been, if this kind of weird scenario and the government hadn't done the things that they did, we're about 2 million jobs behind for legal immigrants, and about 1 million of those with educated legal immigrants. So not talking about the restaurant service industry entry-level jobs, but so that's right there, 5 million jobs that aren't there that probably should have been there. And then you do have kind of just this general pushback that kind of got some steam during the pandemic, which was of this kind of stick it to the man, I don't feel like working, particularly under, or with the cohort of working age men. So, it's kind of an unfortunate outgrowth of the policy as well. And, maybe at some point they're, with inflation, they're kind of forced back into the workforce. But those are kind of the three. The first two are the two main components, and that's kind of like a third smaller component that is impacting why we have so many jobs. So it's a structural issue that, again, was an issue before COVID that was kind of rearing its head, but the policies really exacerbated it and created, instead of a slow shift to this kind of vomiting of all these people out of the workforce. Now, if you were Carol Roth, which, you might want to think about. You're not, but, you might want to think about, you would say, well, We have a lot of, challenges with our debt. We have a lot of jobs available. What's something super clever that the Biden administration could do? Could just fire a bunch of government workers and basically put them back into the regular workforce and go, listen, we need to cut our spending. And I'm doing this at a time when I know that we have 11.2 million jobs available, and you should be able to find something that's fantastic. And I'm going to move you into the private sector, balance, kind of rebalance everything out. That would be bold and clever, and will never, ever, ever happen in a million years.
Yeah, that it'd also be very controversial too, I'm sure. So why? So you mentioned though those 2 million jobs are not being filled by illegal immigrants. Why aren't Americans filling those jobs?
I mean, we just don't have enough Americans that are in the workforce to fill those jobs. I mean, that's part of the issue is that, because of the demographics that we have and the aging population, that legal immigration is part of what we need in order to keep the workforce in balance. And so, certainly not the entire part of it. And there are more people who should be working that need to get in the workforce. But that's an important component if you want to continue to have growth. Now, you can make the argument, well, screw it, let's not have growth and let's have, the opposite. But then you get a bunch of businesses who close and the impacts of that. So that's not really great either. Oh, and by the way, if we did have those legal immigrants that were allowed to come into the country and fill those jobs, we'd have an even worse housing crisis because we're already underbuilt by 4 to 5 million homes. So again, all of these things kind of work together. You can't look at them in one piece, but we got a big mess on our hands for sure.
Yeah, sounds exhausting. This is not a good time to be the president or a lawmaker right now,
or somebody who talks about the economy for a living. I'm trying to help you gain your economic freedom and gain more wealth, and now I have to here's how you survive for the next couple of years. It's not the most uplifting of jobs, but it's important for us to be realistic.
Yeah, definitely. Now, you wrote a book, War on Small Business. Now, I know that a lot of what's going on right now is affecting small business right now, but can you give kind of an idea of how? I mean, I'm wondering if some of this even started before COVID, but what's happened to small business over the past few years amid the COVID-19 pandemic?
I mean, the murder by mandate is the best way I could put it. But as of June of 2020. You had 400,000 small businesses that were murdered by mandate. The number now is probably, and we haven't gotten a good accounting, but I'm guessing it's probably in the 7 figures just based on the pacing of all of that. To put that in perspective, there's only 20-ish thousand big businesses. So that's a huge, huge number that were just killed because they were mandated to be closed while their competitors down the street could stay open. They were not given appropriate, what I would consider, and others have talked about, eminent domain type of compensation for the subjugation of their property rights. And then they have to contend with everything that's come out afterwards. So their competitors have gotten access to abundant, cheap capital in the way of debt. So they're very well financed and able to, have a good, strong balance sheet to withstand all this nonsense that's going on. While if you're a mom and pop, you don't. And then, the labor issues, they, again, don't have sort of the same scale to be able to absorb the cost structure. So they're going to have challenges there. The same thing with the supply chain. Supply chains can obviously favor their bigger customers over the low. So the small businesses are just getting beaten up and punched left, right, sideways. I mean, it's just been an epic disaster, and unfortunately something that the media has refused to focus on.
Yes, they definitely have. And I want to ask a little bit more about that too. Before I go into all that though, just want to remind everybody to do not forget to head on over to libertynation.com, a proud sponsor of A Fresh Perspective. You can Get all of the latest cutting-edge conservative news and analysis with none of the spin and all of the nuance. Like I always say, when you read LibertyNation.com, you're not going to get that usual spin and the superficial talking points that you're used to. You're going to get some in-depth analysis from some very deep writers, myself included, and you'll get a lot more out of it than you would just watching your normal, regular programming. Although keep watching that too, but also read LibertyNation.com because you'll get a lot more deeper than you will with other news sites. So head on over to LibertyNation.com after you're done watching this. Conservative news where truth matters. All right, so Carol, so when it comes to small businesses, there's so much I want to ask. There's just so much here. Do you actually? I was going to ask this later, but I'll ask it now. Do you think that this will ever come back? Because you just said like a devastating number of small businesses were forced to close because of the lockdown orders and all the other crazy stuff that happened during the pandemic. Do you see any signs of it coming back, or what's going on? What do you see for the future?
So this is why I love the fact that you were talking about the nuance with Liberty Nation, because this is where nuance is so important. If you read the headlines, you're going to go, well, Carol, this isn't a big deal at all. Because if you look at the number of small businesses that we have today, it's actually much higher than it was before the pandemic. Now,
Really?
That doesn't mean, yes, and I'll explain that in a second.
Okay.
So we had about 30.2 million small businesses before the pandemic, and we have about 31.7 million now.
Okay.
Now, that's a headline number. So that's net, and it takes into account the fact that, 1 million of them were killed, but all of these people were staying at home and decided, I'm going to do a side hustle. So I'm going to sell on Etsy, or I'm going to trade crypto, or I'm going to do whatever I need, an LLC, or just going to pass it through my income. And that is counted as a business. Most of these businesses, by the way, like most of the small businesses out there, don't have employees. This is just a way that you're making money, and it's counted as a small business. So if you just look at those headlines and you're like, well, we grew our small businesses by, 1.5 million or whatever, like that's amazing. And it's like, it still doesn't take away from the fact that these very productive ones, particularly ones with employees, were killed. And these may not last. And I think we're not going to really know what the real effect is for probably a good 2 years, because small business owners are resilient. They're taking it personally. They may be taking out extra loans on their house, or they may not get it paid themselves to try to save their businesses. I've heard all kinds of just heartbreaking stories. And some of them aren't going to make it, with these wage hikes, with inflation, in every part of their business, with the disruption in the supply chain and all of these things that they have to contend with over time. It's one thing if you're a big chain and you've got 90 locations and we're going to close 2. If your entire business is one location and that's it, like once that's closed, your business is gone. So, I think we're really not going to be able to know the true economic fallout and to see how much in terms of revenue and jobs are shifted towards that, kind of pre-COVID half of the economy that was in those 20,000 big businesses. But even like just right now, 1 in every 60 employed Americans works for Amazon or Walmart. So,
wow.
Yeah. So, I would imagine that consolidation trend increases, and yes, you'll have more freelancers and more kind of solo kind of gigs. But in terms of these opportunities to create real generational wealth and real economic freedom versus just, creating a flexible job for yourself, it's just really put a dent in it. But people in America are going to keep trying, as long as they will let them, and they keep putting up barriers. So I'm just not sure how long that will last.
Yeah, exactly. When you said that we have more small businesses now, I was surprised at first, but then I just thought, I was like, oh, I bet a lot of people are going on their own or doing that side hustle like me, because I did the same thing.
Yeah, here's my thing I made. You buy it from me. I'm sitting at home doing nothing.
Yeah, or you can become a content creator like myself, because I actually did that during the pandemic. I didn't really need to. I could have kept working my day job, but I was tired of it. But still, I would imagine that a lot of other people did. So
you are one of the million plus small businesses that were created during the pandemic, and that's that's what happens. So.
Now, wasn't it? I thought I read like a while ago before all this happened that that small businesses employ like about 50% of
Correct.
employees.
Correct. About half of the workforce and about half of the GDP is attributed to now 31.7 million small businesses, and the other half is attributed to about 20,000+ big businesses. So it's like, you could divide that in half and you can see the decentralized portion and the centralized portion. And when you kind of start looking at things that way, stuff makes a lot more sense.
Yeah, so I'm wondering, and this might fall under what you said before, like we won't know for the next couple of years, but I'm wondering how that's going to be distributed now that the small business market has been so decimated, because like you said, those small businesses are really just people like me who have no employees.
Yeah, and before COVID, they were kind of the premier job creators. More jobs were created with small businesses, like moving up and growing up, than with the big businesses. But now, with the past 2 years in the rearview mirror, I'm not sure that that's going to be the case going forward. We'll see.
Gotcha. So when it comes to the whole pandemic, when that whole thing went down, and you can't really blame this all on Biden because he wasn't president yet.
Right.
Also,
I don't.
Yeah, but even Trump, he didn't order the lockdowns because he couldn't. He was a president.
No, he created the stupid program. 15 days to slow the spread came out of the Trump administration, was the dumbest thing he's ever done during his entire tenure. And he did a few
dumber than his tweets.
And forget the mean tweets. 15 days to slow the spread. And then if you look at the guidance, like the things that they suggested became the blueprint for what the states did. So even though they didn't lock them down, they're like, hey, you may feel like for a couple of weeks locking down like gathering places like a restaurant or a bar. Like, shut up. Don't say what is wrong with you? Why would you say that? So, he created that monster. He built the Frankenstein, and then it took on a life of its own. But that came, sorry, kids, again, this is the truth-telling time. Yeah. That came from the Trump administration. So, it just kind of goes to show you systemically what a problem. It doesn't matter who the person in charge is. Like, systemically, if you let these big entities make the decisions instead of the will of the people, it doesn't matter who's there. The system is what's fundamentally broken.
Yeah. So basically, stupid is stupid, regardless of whether it has an R or a D next to its name.
Let's put it this way: even if they weren't stupid, they're just not able to replicate the information, in the same way that the decisions of millions or billions of people can during the course of a day.
So let me ask you this. When should they have realized that locking everything down wasn't a good idea? Because I can kind of, you're probably going to disagree with this, but I can kind of understand at first if it was actually going to be 2 weeks to slow the spread. But the problem I see with that is that when the government does something like that, they never want to stop. So that would be my issue. But when should they have realized, hey, maybe this isn't a good idea?
February of 2020.
Say that.
Yeah, so the funny thing is, I had this discussion with my husband in February of 2020. It was kind of like, imagine they just locked everyone around the globe down for two weeks. Like, could they even do that? We're both like, nah, nobody would go along with that. That's stupid. Like that would never happen. But what they did is they didn't do that. They just locked down the people who weren't well connected, and they let everyone else go about their business. So if you were still getting your Amazon deliveries and you were still getting your food at the grocery store, and they were all happy, and the stock market was supported, so they didn't care about everybody else. If you had let the stock market go into free fall and you had locked down Amazon and Walmart, this damn thing would not have lasted the 15 days. It would have been done. We would have moved on with our lives. But to answer your question, Jeff, because I think this is a good one, this is one that I spent a lot of time researching and kind of laying out when I wrote The War on Small Business, is that it was like a suppression strategy at that point was never going to work. And so if you're going to have a mitigation strategy, a mitigation to what end? Like, what is it that you are trying to mitigate? How are you going to measure it? And then what are you going to accept going forward? And so we're going to slow the spread to X, and then what? And so just like in terms of sound like problem solving logic. It was a flawed hypothesis to begin with. Like you have to define like how much money are we willing to sacrifice? How much time? How are we measuring this? I mean, the models they used, I'd heard, I think from Michael Malice or something, that one of his podcasts were like built by like some high school student as like a class project, and they weren't even right. They didn't even make sense. Garbage in, garbage out. So, just the entire thought that like, here's like a virus and we're going to try to mitigate it. Like they just didn't have all of the variables, and that was going to be a losing strategy no matter what. What we did know, as we knew, by the way, by the beginning of March of 2020, we knew that it primarily impacted the elderly and people who had these, additional comorbidities. So there's no reason why we couldn't have had some sort of mitigation guidance or strategy that went along, those kinds of lines. But sorry, I don't know what's on my tongue. That's not something that they entertained at all. They didn't want to do that because that didn't kind of go along with the whole narrative. But that was an easy thing to do. And we saw like in New York and in some of those tri-state areas that they did the opposite of that they took infected patients and brought them into nursing homes and by decree, instead of going, okay, this is the place where we need the focus and the mitigation. And I kind of go back to and will challenge anybody who's like, oh, well, we needed to do something. And well, there were like no death pools at like Walmart or like, in Amazon warehouses. So we know that like people who had normal profiles and who were younger could have gone to work. So there's no reason why these small businesses needed to stay closed. And we saw through the behavior of some of the decisions that were made that when they reopened them, and you have to, if you're a bar, you have to serve chips. No, you can't. They can't just be chips. They have to have dip because apparently the queso protects you, from getting COVID. And it's okay. You can walk to your table with a mask, but when you're sitting down, you can take it off because COVID doesn't get you when you're sitting down. I mean, like just the common sense stupidity that people are just kind of like nodding their head going, like that makes sense. That's super concerning to me. Concerning that like anybody's going, any of this freaking makes sense. And here's the thing, like if it's not comfortable to you, I have no problem with you personally not participating in it and doing what's right and what makes you feel good and protected. I do have a huge problem with the government telling the rest of us who have normal common sense that this is the way that we have to behave.
Yeah. And that was always the issue. I mean, because even when all this was going on, like I was concerned, how is this going to impact the economy? I mean, the cure could easily be worse than the disease. I think that's happened. I mean, I kind of wonder, and there's probably no way to quantify this, but how many?
I think there are lots of ways to quantify it. And I think that you can see even just from a disease standpoint, the mental health issues, the number of people who died because they couldn't, get into their doctor to get preventative care. I mean, you're going to get all kinds of accounting for this. This historically will be looked back on as like the, absolute worst set of either policy mistakes or intentions, and you can pick. I'm not going to tell you which one that have been done in modern times. I mean, it's just completely insane.
Yeah, I mean, and one thing that I've heard you mention a lot is how they were doing a lot of picking and choosing. And obviously the bigger businesses were allowed to stay in business, but it sounds like that really prolonged the impact of all the lockdown orders.
100%. If they were shut down, always go back to that. If they were shut down, people would have freaked out, and it would have been this cannot continue on. And I wrote an op-ed in March of 2020 that basically said, like, if you're going to shut the small businesses down, here's how to compensate them. Like, there was an eminent domain way to replace everybody's income from, the same period a year before, whatever their runway was. It would have bought them 2 to 3 months to come up with, a way, to feel better about moving about. But, again, it's stupid. I mean, if you go through some of the examples in the book, one of the worst ones was these cannabis dispensaries. because weed wasn't even legal in most of these jurisdictions a couple of years ago, and now all of a sudden it's an essential business that needs to stay open. I mean, if you just go through and you look at who was shut down and who wasn't, like, again, if you're being intellectually honest and you don't have an IQ of 42, like, you will be able to make that connection. This is not a difficult one to do. It's not one where you need to leap. It's not a conspiracy theory. It's pretty cut and dry.
So, I mean, because I know they had like those loans that were supposed to go to small business, and a lot of that went to big businesses, right? I mean, I don't know all the detail about that, but why did that crash and burn so badly?
So it's just the design of the program. Again, it was like cash for cronies. It was like, great, this is a great way for us to funnel as much money as we can to the people we like. And just like at every step of the way, they made ridiculous decisions. Things like having the banks as the intermediaries and only giving them a certain amount of money. And if you're a bank, who are you going to give the loan to? Like your big client who has a big history and gives you tons of fees, or some random mom and pop who's like now calling you up for the first time? I mean, you can't fault the banks. This is how business is done. I fault the people who designed this. And again, brought this up as it was being designed, and nobody listened. And now, they're calling it, they're just discovering, by the way, I've been yelling about this as many other people have for 2 years. They're just discovering, it's the biggest fraud perpetrated in American economic history. And all these people went out and bought Bentleys and Ferraris and, whatnot. And it's like, no, the biggest fraud is the like trillions of dollars that you transferred from Main Street to Wall Street and the huge inflation that we're all going to have to, like, that's what the biggest fraud is. And you designed this stupid ass program. So like, I mean, the whole thing, the lack of willingness by anybody to take accountability, and the lack of the media, the corporate press to create accountability, it just goes to show that the moral hazard that we have intrinsic in our system.
Yeah, and I wanted to go into that. So last question. I mean, how would you describe the role? I mean, you call it corporate press. I call it the activist media. What doesn't? I mean, it basically says the same thing.
Same thing.
Yeah. Well, what has been their role throughout all this? What do you see has been what damage have they done, and how do they do it?
Yeah, I mean, they are complicit every step in the way. One of the illustrations that I laid out in the War on Small Business was the flip-flopping on mask language. Now, again, some of this is hard to remember, which is why I documented it for history. But what happened when this first was percolating in China is that people went out and bought masks on their own. And they said, just in case this is a thing, I want to protect myself. And the powers that be, who knew that we didn't have enough of at least the N95 masks, the kind that are used in hospitals, right, didn't want you to do a run like you did on toilet paper on masks. They wanted to preserve them, and so they lied. And this is not my interpretation. Fauci is on tape saying that, yes, we intentionally lied to you. So they came out and they said, and it was the Surgeon General, and it was Fauci, and it was a whole slew of people, masks are bad. You don't need them. You're going to catch extra diseases if you get them. Don't do this. Don't do this. I mean, this is in February. This is in March. And at the end of March, NBC News ran a piece making fun of President Trump. And they would say, it's so weird. He would get all caught up in these little things. Like he would ask his advisors, his medical advisors, well, I don't understand. Why aren't we telling people to wear a mask? If the doctors wear them, they should work. Why aren't we telling people that? And then they're like, I believe this idiot's caught up in masks when we got all these other things. And then literally 2 weeks later, they just did an entire 180. And then everyone in the corporate press who've been saying all these things that we have documented and are still living out there on the internet until they take them down, but I've documented them in my book, now went in the opposite direction. And then all of a sudden you were a grandma killer if you weren't going to wear a mask after the people just completely ruined your trust by telling you the mask was going to kill you if you wore it. So you can understand where this distrust has come from. You can understand the media's role, and this idea that this discord was happening because of red states or Trump or whatever.
Yeah.
That's not the case. The case is that the powers that be run, the media ran cover for them and were willing to change up their stories to fit whatever narrative was being spewed out, which, by the way, usually contradicted some narrative that they had put out like a few weeks earlier. And that's, the fact that people aren't willing to hold that accountable either. I mean, this entire podcast, Jeff, is just one tale of non-accountability. I mean, that's basically what it is.
Yeah, you're right. And when you say that they would say one thing one time, then a week later say something different, that is literally true. Like, that's not even an exaggeration.
And by the way, they're still doing it, because going back to the joke about inflation, I mean, I do this all the time. You'll have CNN, who ran a piece on their business site that said, inflation primarily impacts the rich. Here's why it can be good for everyday Americans, which we know is a lie. And then, we're forced to go, oh boy, inflation really hurts the poor in a segment last week. And you can just put them together. But they're the ones that have been trying to spin their way out of inflation for this entire time, that the rest of us, with, like, again, you don't need an economic degree. Like, you just need to understand basic supply and demand and things like that. You knew that this was what's going to happen. So yeah, not so good. Not so good.
Yeah, I hear you. Well, I mean, I definitely appreciate you joining us. I mean, I think it's everything you said is stuff that we need to hear. It's not pleasant, but I mean, I'm glad that there are people out like you out there who are speaking this truth, regardless of party. Like, you're not partisan with this. Like, you're telling it like it is. So I really hope that you keep doing it. I know you will, but I really appreciate this. And I don't know if people tell you this, but I think what you're doing is very important. So I'm very grateful for that.
Well, I'm really hoping to extract myself from this and host a game show and give you fabulous cash and prizes. So I know you all hope I keep doing this. I really don't. But let me ask you a question back, because as a finance person, obviously I'm kind of mired in this. And I understand people don't really understand this, but like, why have we not had any recent like wholesale protests over the economy? Like, why are we not seeing a march against the Fed or on Washington, like super angry about the fact that they have just completely messed with our finances with no accountability? I'm one who can point out these problems. I'm not a good community organizer. We all have our roles in the world, but there obviously are really good ones. Like, why aren't they organizing around those topics?
I would say it's because we don't have enough of you. I mean, honestly, and when I said earlier that I really do believe that the reason they get away with a lot of this stuff is because the average American, we may know on some level that this stuff affects us, but we don't know how and why. We don't understand the connection between these policies and how it affects us. So we don't even know enough to be able to get out there. Two, I say a second reason is right now, Carol, and you probably noticed this, our political discourse sucks. We are very much into what I call a team sports mentality. So just like you pointed out Trump's mistakes, for a conservative audience, a lot of people aren't. I mean, they might know, in their heads that that's true, but we have to play this team sports mentality where our guy can never do anything wrong, but it's always the other guy's fault. So since we have that mentality, we're not going to stand up to our own and say, no, you jacked up. Or Democrats aren't going to say, "Oh, Biden, you're jacking up." I mean, what's going on here? Right now is the other side is bad, and that's it. So we can't even come together on a lot of this, and that's why I say not all of this stuff is left versus right or Democrat versus Republican. A lot of it is, but a lot of it isn't. A lot of this stuff is
everyone's paying X dollars a tank for gasoline. Everyone's paying, X dollars for ground beef. As it calls the Green Party. This is the green in your wallet that's no longer in your wallet anymore. So the new Green Party.
Yeah, I mean, it's the elites versus the rest of us. And right now the elites are winning because we don't know enough. And they have ways of keeping us at each other's throats and distracting us. We're more concerned about Will Smith slapping Chris Rock than we are about the things that you just talked about.
Yeah, I mean, it's true. And I will tell you that when you go to, the grocery store, or you think about your generational wealth, their policies are going to play a much bigger role in that than either Will Smith or Chris Rock. And I hope that, people will be willing to keep hearing folks like myself out, learning about these things. It's confusing. It's confusing on purpose. And I'm happy to keep repeating and keep walking people through it, until it clicks. It doesn't bother me. I want people to understand it, and I want people to get really angry because we need, as I keep calling it, a total HGTV renovation. Rip the house down to the studs because you can't just do a redecorating. That's not going to work anymore. There is mold, there's mildew. You got to tear everything down.
Yeah, tear it down. Yeah, you got to condemn the building. Our government is a condemned building. I think that's what it should be. I mean, it's horrible. I think, and I think that it will change, but it's going to change one way or the other. I'm just afraid that it'll change because we learned the hard way, and that hard way might be pretty hard. So I really don't want to go to that.
I won't even go with the things that people are saying, but the most likely outcome for change is not one that any of us want to see. So hopefully we can find a peaceful way to do that.
Yes, definitely. And with that, well, before we go, why don't you tell everybody where they can find you?
Oh, don't find me. No, I'm just kidding. Find Don't bother me. I'm super tired. You can find me on Twitter at Carol J.S. Roth. And that's really just kind of the best way until, by the way, they kick me off the platform. And then whatever. Then I go host my game show, I guess. I don't know.
Yes. And your book, The War on Small Business.
Yes.
Buy it.
Yes, and buy it from a local small business if you can. Bookshop.org fulfills my book and many others from local small business retailers. And vote with your dollars, guys, because you can't complain about the big companies and go run to them every time you have a need. So just think about that too. Yeah.
All right. Well, Phil, thank you very much for joining. We got to do this again sometime, and hopefully things will have maybe gotten less worse then.
I hope so, Jeff. Thank you so much for hosting me, and so glad that we could finally connect real time because we always connect on Twitter. But this is really fun.
Yeah, it was. Awesome. Thank you.